In this video we're going to learn about Pino.js, which is a JavaScript package used for logging. And this package is often used in applications that use back-end Node.js frameworks such as Express and Fastify. We'll see a little bit of that later in the video. We're going to learn about the main features of Pino.js, including how you can send your logs to a remote aggregation service such as BetterStack, where you can then search and analyze those logs quite efficiently and build things like dashboards and charts. And Pino.js has all of the core features that you would expect in a production-ready logging package. For example, log levels and transports that allow you to send your logs to different locations, and formatters that allow you to customize the output format of the logs that are generated. We're going to see examples of all of those, so let's dive in and get started. Now let's start by having a quick look at the Pino.js GitHub page. You can see it's got 12,400 stars, so this is a very popular logging package in JavaScript. And as the About section says, it's a super fast, all-natural JSON logger. So the output by default from your Pino logs are going to be JSON. And that's very useful because that's a structured format that allows you to then go in and extract particular pieces of data from the logs. What I'm going to do in this video to start with is open up VS Code, and I have an empty index.js file here. What we're going to do is initialize a Node.js project, and we're then going to install Pino.js. So let's open a terminal here, and I'm just using the built-in VS Code terminal here. To initialize a project, we can use the npm init command, and that is then going to create the package.json file, as you can see on the left-hand side. And when we click through to that, we get some basic information about the project. I'm going to clear the terminal, and we can then run npm install, and the name of the package that we're going to use is Pino. So let's install that, and that's then going to install that into this project, and it's going to generate the node modules folder that you see here. And you can see in the node modules folder we have a variety of packages, including Pino and all of its dependencies. So Pino itself has dependencies, and you can see these listed out in the node modules folder. So we'll work with Pino.js in this video. Let's close the package.json file. And actually, before I do that, you can see that Pino has been added to the dependencies of this particular Node.js project. So let's close that, and we're going to work in index.js. So let's start by creating a logger, and we're going to output some logs into the standard output, into the terminal basically. In order to find out how to do that, let's go to the documentation, and we're going to go to one of these pages here, the API section, and this one here is the function that's used to create a logger. So let's look at that just now. We have a function called Pino, and this takes some options and a destination, and it returns a logger instance. So let's start by using this function and creating the logger. We need to import the module, so we're going to do that using the require statement, and the name of the package is Pino. Once we've got that imported, we can create a logger instance. So let's create a logger variable here, and we can call this Pino function, and that's going to give us back that logger instance. Once we have the logger instance, we can call methods on that logger, for example logger.info, and we can pass a message into that, for example hello from Pino, and that's going to then output that to the terminal. And we have different methods on the logger instance. It's not just info, we have different levels here, and this is the log levels I mentioned in the intro. So when different events occur in your application, you're going to give different levels of severity to these incidents. So as well as logger.info, let's have a more critical example, and let's say we have an error in the application. We can also use the logger.error method, and let's output a message here saying a critical error has occurred. So now that we're calling a couple of these methods on the logger instance, let's run this index.js file. We can do that by using the node index.js command, and we can see the output of these logs just below here. So in the output we're getting some JSON data, and we have keys for the log level. For example, that's set to 30 for logger.info and 50 for logger.error. We have the timestamp when this output was generated. We have the process ID of the process that generated this log. We also have the hostname of the machine that generated the logs, and also the message. This is the message that was passed into the function. So for example, logger.info, we passed hello from Pino, and that's what's output into this message key. Now we're seeing this on the terminal when we run the index.js file, and that's because by default Pino is going to send your logs to standard output, and that means that they appear here in the terminal. Of course, we can configure different locations, different places to ship your logs to, and we're going to do that later in the video. And this is done by using the concept of a transport in Pino.js. We'll see that later on. Now we can make the output of these logs nicer by looking at another package. For example, here is one called pino-pretty, and this is a prettifier for your Pino logs. And if we scroll down to the README here, to the description of this package, what this is going to do is it's going to detect if an incoming line looks like it could be a line from an ND-JSON logger, and then it's going to apply extra formatting by considering things like the log level and the timestamp. So let's get an example of how that looks like now. To start with, of course, we need to install the package. So let's go down here and copy this command here, npm install, and we've got the -g flag here. We don't really need that. We're just going to install it locally for this particular project. So npm install pino-pretty, and you could also save that to development dependencies if you would like, using the -d flag. We're not going to do that. We've installed it locally into the project. And then what we can do, if we go back to the GitHub page, under the usage section here, we can pipe the output of running our application to this pino-pretty module. Now what I'm going to do is go back to the terminal, and I'm going to run a command here. So let's run the node index.js command, and that's going to remind us of what the logs looked like before. And I'm going to make the terminal bigger here. What we can also do is pipe the output and use npx and then pino-pretty, and that's going to pipe them through to that new module that we've just installed. And here is an example of the output after it's been piped through the pino-pretty module. So we have a nicer looking timestamp that tells us the current time, and that's a little bit better than this Unix timestamp. We also have different log levels here, the info and the error levels, and we have different colors being applied to each of those levels. And we still get the message, and you can see the coloration applied to that message as well. So this is a bit nicer to look at from a human perspective. But of course, we also have the option to use these structured logs, and that's going to be helpful when we send the logs or when we ship them to a remote service. So let's now move on. We're going to look at creating a custom log level, and you can see we've used two log levels here. We have the info and the error levels. Let's start by going to the documentation, and we can see all of the default levels that come with Pino.js. And we have these in decreasing order of severity. So this one is the most severe problem, or the most severe level that can occur in your application, and that's the fatal level. We also have error, warn, info, debug, and trace. And for most applications, I think these levels will serve most of your purposes, but you might want to create a custom log level. Let's very quickly see how to do that if we go back to VS Code. What we can do when we create the logger instance by calling the Pino function is pass a JavaScript object that's going to configure this logger with some options. And one of these options is the custom levels option, and we can set that to another JavaScript object. And the key that we give here is the name of the level that we want to add to the default levels that come with Pino.js. So let's say that we wanted to add a level called catastrophe, and we give that a value that indicates the numerical value of this particular log level. So we have logger.error here, and we can see that that's of level 50. If we go to a level of 70, that's a more severe example. It's a higher log level, and therefore catastrophe is regarded as more critical than the logger.error level. Once we've added the custom level, we can actually then call a function on the logger object with the key that we've given to this object. So to see an example of that, let's call logger.catastrophe, and we can pass a message into that, and let's say catastrophic error. So that's a new function that's been added to the logger object, and we've added it through this custom levels configuration that we're passing in when we create the logger. So I've cleared the console, and I'm going to make the terminal bigger. Let's rerun the application, and I'm going to pipe the output to the pino-pretty module, and we can see what we get back here. And we're getting the message catastrophic error, but this time we have a custom user level, so that's not showing up with any colors or anything like that. If we take away the piping and just call index.js, we can see the output, and this time you can see the level has that number of 70 that we configured for this catastrophe custom level. So it's very easy to add custom levels if you need them on top of what's given by default. What we can also do when we create the Pino logger is we can pass a default log level. We can do this by adding another key to this object that we're using to configure the Pino logger, and that's the level key, and we can set that to one of the levels, and that's going to be the default level for our logger. Any output that's below that level is not going to be shown up in the output. So for example, if we set this to the warn level, our logger.info output here, that's not actually going to be shown on the terminal. And that's because the info log level has a numerical value of 30, as we can see in the terminal. We're setting the default to the warn level, which has a value of 40. So only warn outputs and above are going to be shown in the terminal. So let's save this, and we're going to rerun this. And instead of seeing all 3 of these outputs, we're now going to see only 2 of them. We see the logger.error and logger.catastrophe outputs, but the logger.info is now no longer shown, and that's because we're setting the default level to warn. Now I'm going to set that back to what actually is the default value here, and that's info. And we're now going to move on with the video and see how we can set this through an environment variable, which is a very common practice for your log levels. What we can do here in the level key is we can actually look at the process.env, which is going to give us access to environment variables. And the process is a module built into Node.js. Once we get to that, we can look for a particular key, and I'm going to set a key called pino log level here. And if that exists, it's going to set it to whatever that value is. But we also maybe need to handle the case where that is not set. We can do that by using an OR expression in JavaScript, and we can set a default value if this turns out to be undefined. So let's set the default value, if we don't have that environment variable, to the info log level. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the terminal a bit bigger here, and we're going to try and run this. And what I'm going to do, now I'm on Windows here on PowerShell, I'm going to set an environment variable. This will be different on a Mac OS or a Unix operating system. But on PowerShell, what I can do is set the env pino log level to warn. So we're setting the default log level to warn. When I now run node index.js, what's going to happen is we're not going to see the info output again for the same reasons as earlier in the video. But if we change this environment variable and set it to info again, we should now see, after we execute that we get all 3 outputs. So we can now set things through the environment. And that's a common practice for log levels, and it adheres with the 12-factor methodology for configuring your applications. Now if you're on a Unix system, then what you can do is you can set the environment variable when you are actually executing the script. So you can set pino log level equals warn, and then run index.js. And of course you need the node command in order to do that, but what you're doing before you actually execute the script is you're setting the log level. And what you can also do on Unix is you can set the pino log level for the duration of the terminal session by using the export command. So let's now move on. We're going to look at formatters now. I'm going to go to the documentation for Pino.js. A formatter is an object that contains functions for formatting the shape of your log lines. And these functions should return a JSONifiable object, and they allow for full customization of your resulting log lines. Now in order to customize this, we can add a formatter's key to the configuration object that we're passing to the Pino function here. So let's add a new key called formatters, and we're going to set this to a JavaScript object. And let's say that we want to change the output for the level. Now if you remember, the level was output as a numerical value, for example 30 for the info level and 50 for the error level. For the level key, in order to customize that, we can provide a function here, and it's going to take the label for that level. And what we're going to do is we're going to return a new JavaScript object. Remember, this has to be JSON-ifiable, and this object can allow us to set another value that we want to see for the level key in the output. So what we're going to do is set the level to the label that we have, and we're going to make that an uppercase string by calling the toUppercase method. And we can then save that, and what we're going to do is we're going to run node index.js, and you can see the different formats now for the level key in the output. We have the uppercase log levels label now, instead of using that numerical value, and that works as well with our custom level, the catastrophe level. We can see the output there, and that might be a better way for you to represent your output. It's up to you, but you can use these formatters in order to change the output format of your logs. So we're learning how to configure the Pino object in order to get the output that we want, but this is at the moment just using the default keys and values that we get when we send a logger.info or error and so on. Each of these methods outputs the same set of keys, but often in your logs you want to enrich those logs with useful information about particular events that are happening in your application. So how do we add some custom context to the logs? Let's see how to do that now. What I'm going to do to start with is remove the logger.catastrophe example, and we can remove that custom level that we have as well. We no longer need that. And I'm going to target this logger.error call that we have, As well as the message, we can actually pass as a first parameter an object of key value pairs that are going to be added to the log output. So let's show an example of that. We're going to add a JavaScript object as the first argument here. And let's say that we have a user who's making a particular call to a backend service, and we want to output the user's username here. And let's just call them John Doe for demonstration purposes. So we're adding a custom JavaScript object as the first argument to our logger method. If we save the file and go back to the terminal and run node.index.js, you can see for the error output, we are now getting this additional key value in the output. So what we need to do if we want to customize the JSON that's returned from our logger methods is simply add a JavaScript object containing the information we need as a first argument to these logger methods. And we can also pipe this output to the pino-pretty module, and we're going to see that the output from that contains the custom keys and values just underneath the original message. So it's very easy to add this custom information, and we can add as many key value pairs as we want to this JavaScript object, and as long as it's JSON serializable, it's going to appear in the output of the logs. You can see this other key and value that we've added here. Let's now see another example. We're going to look at how to create a child logger and what that entails in Pino.js. Let's remove this second value here, but let's assume that we always wanted to output the username into the log files just to track which users were making the different requests and performing different actions in our application. So we now have a logger.info call and a logger.error call, and to both of those we're passing a username of John Doe. Now if we execute this, it's going to work fine, and we're going to see that username appear in both of these log outputs. But let's imagine we have a lot of logs and we have the same keys and values that we want to output all the time. We can create what's called a child logger in order to consolidate that into a child object of the default logger. And to do that, let's have a look at the documentation for Pino.js on child loggers. You can see a link to that in the description of the video. What you can do is you can call the logger.child method, and you can pass this JavaScript object of all of the keys and values you want to use when you are working with an instance of that child logger. So let's go back to VS Code and create one of those just now. So just above these two functions, I'm going to create some variables here. Let's create a variable called username, and we'll set that to John Doe. And as I've said here, you might get this property from the request.user object in your express handler function, for example. But for now, let's just hard code that in the application. And then underneath that, we're going to create a new logger here called username logger. And that's going to be an instance of the logger that we created here by calling the Pino function. We're going to use that and call the .child method on that. And here is where we pass the custom keys and values that we need to that child logger. So what I'm going to pass here is the username, and we're going to set that equal to the username that we have on the line above. Now the benefit of doing this is it means that we can use this username logger here instead of the default logger. So let's replace that with the username logger, and we can then remove these JavaScript objects here. So I'm going to remove these, and we can then just pass in the message, and by default the username will be output on both of those calls. So let's test this out. I'm going to clear the terminal and rerun the command. And when we look at the output here, we can see we still get the username in the output, but we haven't needed to pass that object into these logging calls, these methods, and that's because we're now using the child logger that has that set by default. So if you have a logger in your application and you need to pass the same keys and values multiple times, you might want to create that child logger, and that makes the code a lot more maintainable. It makes it a lot easier to write that code. And if you need to change things, you can do it in one place, and that's where you define the child logger. Let's now move on to another example, and we're going to show how to log errors in our application. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do at the very top of this file is define a JavaScript function, and that's a function called divide. That's going to take two arguments, a and b, and it's simply going to return a divided by b. So a very simple divide function. It's redundant in JavaScript because we have a division operator. But let's try and work with this, and we're going to show some errors that might occur as you use this function. Now at the bottom, I'm going to comment out this code that we just wrote, and I'm going to write some new code here. And let's say we wanted to log out the division of two numbers here, so logger.info, and I'm going to use a JavaScript template string here, and let's say we get the result, which is going to be equal to the divide function, and we're passing two numbers into that function. Let's pass in 5 and 0. So when we pass those in, it's going to take those two numbers and it's going to divide 5 by 0. and that's going to create a problem in the application. So let's clear this out and run node index.js. If we look at the message that's outputted, we get a result of infinity. So the problem here, of course, is that we're dividing by 0 and we're getting an output here in JavaScript of infinity. Now what we're going to do in order to make this divide function a little bit better is we're going to check if b is equal to 0. And if that's the case, we're not going to perform this division. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to throw a new error, and we're going to pass a message into that error saying that we cannot divide by 0. So now there is a possibility that this function is going to return, or rather throw, an error. So let's go back down and we're going to surround this in a try catch statement. So what we're going to do, we're going to try and get the result by calling divide. So let's create a variable here called result, and we're going to call divide and pass those two arguments in. And then we can catch that exception. So we're going to catch the error, and what we're going to do if we get that error is we can create another logging statement here. So logger.error, and what we're going to do in order to actually pass the error through to the logging output is we're going to pass the error as a first argument to logger.error. And as well as the error, we're going to pass a message as always. We're going to say that an error occurred during the division. So now we're calling divide here in a try block, and if we get that error, what's going to happen is we're going to go to the catch block and we're going to use our logger and output that error. So just by passing the error as a first argument, we should hopefully see that in the output. Let's make the terminal bigger, and we're going to run node index.js, and this time we can see some different output, and it's quite hard to read that. So what I'm going to do is pipe that through to the pino-pretty module, and you can then see hopefully a better representation of that error that we have. And we have a key called error, and you can see the entire object here, including a stack trace. And within that we have the message cannot divide by 0, and that is coming from the error that we have here. That's the message we passed when we had that throw new error statement. So that's all available in the output here. All we need to do, if we need to log the error objects, is pass that error to our logger methods, and that's going to appear in the JSON output. So we've now covered log levels, we've now covered formatters, and creating child loggers in the application. We've covered how to pass context into our logging methods, and we've also seen how to pass errors into our methods as well. We're now going to move on to a new concept, and that's transports in Pino.js. Transports allow us to determine where the logs are going to be sent to. Now by default, what we've been doing so far is just outputting the logs to the terminal. So the logs by default will be sent to standard output, but it's very common to want to send your logs to files or to remote services over the network. Let's now look at Pino transports. What we're going to do is go to the documentation, and you can see that transports can be used to both transmit and also to transform your log output. And one of the things to note here is that it's recommended that any log transformation or transmission is performed either in a separate thread or in a separate process. And from Pino version 7 and upwards, these transports can now operate inside a worker thread, and this helps your performance. You can imagine if we have an API, for example, and you want to do some logging, you don't want to have a transport that's logging to a file or over the network. These operations might take some time, and that might delay the response that you're sending to your clients. You don't want that, so you can actually do this work in a worker thread or in a different process, and that's going to speed things up and allow you to respond to requests much quicker. Now what is a transport under the hood? It's a module that defines, or rather it exports a default function that returns a writable stream in Node.js. And this is useful to know if you're going to write your own transports, but for example there is a built-in transport for sending the logs to a file, and we have npm packages available if you want to send them to remote services such as BetterStack. Now I'll leave a link to this page below the video. We're going to go to the API section, and I'm going to scroll down here to the pino.transport function, and I'm going to go to this function. What this does is it creates a stream that routes the logs to a worker thread that wraps around a Pino transport. What we can do is call pino.transport, and we provide a target to that as well as some options. And you can see a couple of examples below here. We call pino.transport and we're providing multiple targets. For example, one target is the pino-pretty module, and another one is the built-in pino/file target. And when we specify pino/file, we have the options with a destination key, and that destination is where the logs are going to be written to. We're going to see an example of that now, so let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to minimize this terminal and scroll to the top. Just above where we create the logger instance, what we're going to do now is create a transport. So let's create a variable here called transport, and we're going to call pino.transport and provide the object here that's going to define these transports. So we need a target, so we're going to use the built-in pino/file target. And what we also need is the options for this target. We need to specify the destination, and that's going to be a file where the output logs are going to be sent to. And what I want to do here is specify a directory within my local directory, and that's going to be called logs. And we can then send the logs, let's just say, to a file called output.log. And as you can see on the left hand side, we don't currently have a directory called logs, so we can also pass a makedir argument to this options, and we can set that to true, and that's going to create the directory if it doesn't already exist. So this is a transport object, and that's going to output the logs to a file. We now need to tell the pino-logger object about this, so let's copy the name of the variable, and this is the second argument to the logger. This entire first argument here is the options that configure the logger, and that's a JavaScript object. We're now going to add a second argument, and that's going to be the transport. And remember, when we're using the pino.transport, it's going to run the logging in a separate thread. So let's now test this out, and I'm going to make the terminal bigger here, and we're going to run node index.js. And you can see when that runs, we no longer have the output on the standard output on the terminal. Instead, we now have a logs directory, and we have a file here called output.log. If we click through to that, we get the JSON for that log output for the error message. So now our logs are being sent to a file, and we can specify different transports. For example, if I go back to this definition here, rather than pino-file, we can set the target to pino-pretty. And pino-pretty will understand if we set the destination to a file that it's going to output to that file. And we can also pass, because we're not sending that to the terminal, we can pass colorize as false here, and that's going to remove the color from that output. Let's try this again, and we're going to run index.js, and if we go back to our output.log file, you can see we have a different format where the logs have been piped through the pino-pretty module, and we can see in this case the error more clearly. So it depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for structured logging, you might want the JSON, but for human readable logging, you might want to use the pino-pretty module. Now we can also log to multiple locations. So far we've logged to standard output or to a file, but what if we wanted to log to both? Let's see how we can do that now. If we go back to the pino.transport call, we can provide a key called targets here, and that's going to be an array in JavaScript. And each object within that array will define a specific target that we want to use as a transport. So we have the pino-pretty module here that's outputting to our output.log file. We might want to add a second transport that's going to output to the terminal. So again, we want the target here to be pino-pretty, and let's set the options here in order to set the destination to standard output. In order to set that to standard output, we can use the process module in Node.js. That has a standard out property, and then we can use the file descriptor in order to send the logs to that file descriptor. Now before we run this, I want to highlight something in the Pino documentation, and that's for the formatters object that we defined earlier in the video. What we did earlier was customize the level, as you can see below here, and you can see this note here that the log level cannot be customized when you use multiple transports. And that's what we're doing in VS Code. We have a transport object, but we're defining multiple targets now. In order for this to work, we need to remove this formatters block of code here. So let's remove that, and we are now just going to pass a level in when we're customizing the pino-logger, and we can pass the transport as a second argument. Let's now save this file, and we're going to make the terminal bigger here. When we run node index.js, we now get the output appearing in the terminal, but it's also going to be sent to our output file here. So output.log also contains that output. So now we have multiple transports. The logs are being shipped to multiple locations, and we can control that by defining this pino.transport object that contains multiple targets. Now we have a few more things to show in this video. Let's now see how we might want to redact sensitive data from our log files. Now it's vitally important that you don't output sensitive data into logs. You need to assume always that these logs can be read by anybody. They might be read by malicious actors. So you might want to redact certain data from your log output. Let's now see how to do that using Pino.js. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to define an object just below the logger instance. So let's remove the code for dividing here. We don't need that anymore. And I'm going to remove this code at the bottom just to clean things up a little bit. And we can also remove the divide function. So what we're left with here is the pino.transport call and also our logger itself. Now what I'm going to do is define an object, and this is a JavaScript object that just contains some details. The object is called employee, and employees have an ID, a name, age, email, password, and address. Now some of this information you might want to have in your logs. For example, you might want to log out the name of a user or their ID. But on the other hand, you probably don't want to output the email, you definitely don't want to output the password, and you don't want to output the address either. So what I'm going to do is add below that a call to logger.info, and we're going to pass that employee object in as well as a message. And let's give this a message of employee record, and we can then save that and clear the terminal. If we then run node index.js, we get the output here that contains all of the keys and values, all of the fields in that employee record. Now I've moved the terminal to the right hand side so that we can see this a little bit better as we build this example. What we're going to do is try and redact the email, the password, and the address from this employee record. So what we can do in order to do that is we can pass another key to the Pino options, and this key is a key called redact, and we can set this to an array of values that we want to hide from the output. So for example, I want to hide the email, the password, and the address from the log output. If we add that array of values for the redact key, we can save this file and we can then run the example on the right hand side, and we're going to see a different output this time. We have the employee record, and you can see the values here for the ID and the age, but the sensitive fields with the email, the password, and the address, they all contain this redacted string instead of the raw value. And that's important as it can stop us logging that sensitive information to the terminal or to our log destinations. And we can also change the redact key here to a JavaScript object. So I'm going to change that to an object just now. And the keys that we have here, for example, the paths are going to be set to that array that we defined before. But as well as just redacting them, we can actually remove them from the output if we want to save some space in our log files or stop sending as much information over the network. Instead of the raw value of redacted, we can provide a key here called remove and set that to true. And then when we run this again on the right hand side, this time we don't get the redacted values, we only get the raw values for the ID and the age. So this shows how we can redact sensitive data from our log output. What I'm going to do now is install Fastify, which is a backend framework for Node.js, and we're going to see how we can use Pino with that framework. We're going to see this very quickly, and then we'll move on to the last part of the video. So let's have a look at the Fastify documentation. You can see it's a package that has 29,000 stars. So we're talking about a very popular web framework for Node.js. Let's start by installing that. So if we go down to the README and click install, we can install it into our directory here with the npm install command. So npm install Fastify. I pasted that in there. We're going to run that, and then we can create a new file in this application. I'm going to call this app.js, and this is going to contain the code to create a very basic web server. Now it turns out that Fastify actually uses Pino.js by default. And in order to get that working, you can create the Fastify object by importing it. So require Fastify, and then once you create that object, you instantiate it and provide a JavaScript object of configuration. And in order to activate Pino.js, we just simply pass logger true to that object. Once we've done that, we can define an API route in the application. We can do that with the fastify.get function, for example. So this is the API route, and that's going to take a callback function when it gets a request, which will take the request as the first argument and the reply as the second argument. And we can log out some data here by using request.log. That gives us access to the Pino instance. And then we can use the normal methods that we saw before on that Pino logger, for example, error, fatal, info, and trace. So let's log out an info call here, and we're going to pass the request in. That's going to output the details from the request, and then we can pass a message here of request to the server. And then we can send a very simple response with the reply.send function. And let's say that this API endpoint is just going to return a very simple piece of data. So let's return a JavaScript object with the key of hello and the value of world. We can then create the server itself by using the fastify.listen function, and to that we can pass a port. So let's listen on port 3000. So that's our listen function. If we now run this application with node app.js, you can see we're already getting some log output here. And what I'm going to do is go to the browser, and we're going to send a request to localhost 3000, and we're going to check if we get this log output here. So let's go to the browser and send that request, and we get back the data that we specified from that handler function, and that's the hello world piece of JSON data here. And what we get back if we look at the terminal is some logging. And you can see the message in this output here. It doesn't look particularly good with all of this text on the right hand side, but you can see request to server is the message, and that matches what we passed in here to request.log.info. So if we have a request in our Fastify handler function, we can access the logger through the request.log property. And by default, Fastify, as I said earlier, it's using Pino.js as its logging package. So everything we've learned in this video about how to customize Pino loggers, this will apply when you're using Fastify as your framework. And also if you're using something like Express or Nest.js, you can also configure those to use Pino as the logging framework. And what we're going to do now to finish the video is we're going to show how we can define a transport that's going to send our logs to a centralized location on the web using BetterStack. And this has many benefits. It allows us to consolidate our logs in a central location. It allows us to build indexes over those logs, and then allows us to search very rapidly to find the data that we need, and also to build dashboards and charts and analytics around the log data that's coming in. So in order to do this, let's cross over to the BetterStack platform. We have the log service here, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a source. Now we can hover over the info icon, and as it says, sources represent services you want to collect logs from. So we have a service, let's say here in our application, this very simple index.js file containing a Pino logger. We want to send those logs to a source, and that source is going to be on BetterStack. So let's create the source, and we'll give it a name of pino-demo. We also need to select a platform. I'm going to select the JavaScript Node.js platform, and then we're going to create that source. Now once that source is created, what you'll get back is a token here. You can click this to copy that, and then we can go back to the index.js file, and we're going to paste, or rather we're going to create a variable with that token stored in it. So just at the top here, I'm going to create a variable called token, and we'll set that equal to that value. Now in a real application, you want to extract that and store it somewhere secure, for example as an environment variable. But for now, let's just store it as a raw value, and then we're going to reference that in a second. Now let's cross over to the documentation for using JavaScript and Node.js with BetterStack. BetterStack provides clients for JavaScript and Node.js, and it provides these clients for multiple JavaScript logging frameworks. The one we're using, of course, is Pino, and we have a transport that we can use for Pino, but there are other frameworks that you can see here as well. So let's click the Pino transport, and we'll be taken to the page here. And I'll leave a link to this in the video description. And the first step here is to install the Logtail Pino npm package. This will allow us to send the logs via a transport to the BetterStack log platform. So let's copy the npm install command, and the terminal is currently on the right hand side, so let's paste that command in. Once that's installed, what we're going to do is add another transport to this list of transports that we have here in the targets key. So let's scroll down, and we're going to define a new JavaScript object for the third transport in this list. We're going to set the target equal to that package that we've just installed, so it's at logtail/pino, and then we can set the options here. And what we're going to do is pass, as before, a JavaScript object. We're going to set a key of source token, and we're going to make that equal to the token that we created here on line 3. So let's paste that token in, and that token is basically going to allow us to send those API requests with the logs to the BetterStack log platform, and allow us to ship the logs to that location for further searching and analysis. So let's save this, and I'm going to scroll down, and what we're actually logging at the moment is this employee. We're using a logger.info statement. I'm going to add a couple of extra statements here. Let's bring back the logger.error statement, and we can add one final statement, and we'll use the logger.warn method to warn that we have a deprecated package. Now this time when we run index.js, we're expecting to see the output on standard out and also in that log file, because those are the two transports that we had before. But we're also going to see that the logs are shipped to the BetterStack log platform. So let's save this file, and we're going to clear the terminal and run the index.js file, and we're getting that output, and that has finished running that script. Let's now go back to the browser, and we're going to go to this page here where we created the source earlier on. If we click the live tail of this source, hopefully we're going to get those messages, and we do. And the logs that we see here, these correspond to the logs from these functions that we called, and we have the messages appearing in the BetterStack tail here. Now we can click these to see more information. For example, if we want to look at this employee record log, we get the details from that log that now appear on the BetterStack log management platform. For example, the age of the employee is here, and we get all those default details from the Pino logging, such as the host name, the level, and the message. Now the cool thing here is that if we go back to the central page here, we can actually search these logs. For example, if we wanted to get all error logs, we can specify a search of log equals error, and then that will filter down the logs and only give us back the ones where the log level is equal to error. And you can search on a variety of different fields here. For example, if we wanted to look for a message that contains a particular value, we could search for the message and then we can use the contains operator. And if we look back to the functions here, we're going to take the logger.info call. That said employee record, so let's look for any messages that contain the word employee. We're going to get back the record where the message contains the word employee. So it's very easy to search your logs on BetterStack, and all the fields that are sent to the platform using that transport, these will be indexed on the back end, and that allows you to search through your logs very efficiently and very quickly to get the results you need. And of course you can go further and build dashboards and charts and get some further insights into your log data. And that's all for this video. We've seen how to use Pino.js as a logging package in JavaScript. And we've seen all of the core features that provides, from log levels to transports to formatters and so on. If you're interested in further videos, for example pairing Pino.js with Express or Nest.js, let us know in the comments. And if you're interested in other JavaScript logging packages such as Winston and you'd like to see videos on those, please also let us know in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and if you're interested in more videos like this, please subscribe to the BetterStack YouTube channel, and we'll see you in the next video.